stimulus update for September 22nd, talking about the stimulus check, unemployment, PPP. Today, before Congress, was the Fed Reserve Chairperson Powell and the U.S. Secretary to the Treasury, Mnuchin, and they were talking about the programs that are in play. But a couple of things that came out of that I think is interesting is potentially a shift in looking at the aid that's already been accounted for versus the aid that has been provided. And what do I mean by that? Out of the CARES Act, there was the Main Street Lending Program that came into play. And out of that, there is only $2 billion that's being reported that has been loaned out of that program. So this is a program that has $500 billion, $600 billion that was allocated to it, which is almost the same as the total amount that was allocated to PPP and when PPP received more funds back in April. So $600 billion and only $2 billion loaned out leaves $598 billion. We know that there's a little over $100 billion that is left over from when they replenished PPP back in April. So these two things together, not to mention the monies that got returned from PPP 1.0 for either businesses that really didn't ultimately need it, or they had access to public funds or investment dollars. So we have a ton of money that has already been quote unquote provided, but hasn't been fully taken advantage of, accounted for. So my wonderment here is that if you were to take into account the money that hasn't been used and it's reappropriated, there may be a much easier time for Congress to jump over the hurdle to actually provide relief here. I'm not providing anything to you to let you now think that this is going to happen this week, but what I do want you to know is out of the hearing today with Mnuchin and Powell, they were the ones that were really pointing this out to Congress. The stimulus checks seem to be obvious. The administration, as in the White House, is for it. I had talked about this before, but the White House is really basically veering towards the Democrats. The Democrats had a HEROES Act at 3.3. They're down to 2.2. The Republicans haven't really been able to pass anything. And the White House is now going to be, as I've predicted, aligning itself, it's being written that way, with the Democrats, because the Democrats at least have a HEROES Act out there. The House has a problem solver caucus that has come up with a $1.5 billion deal. I've talked about this in my other stimulus updates. So there is momentum, but when you have the two heads of the money in the United States, Federal Reserve Chairperson Powell, U.S. Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin, and they're saying, listen, these programs that were out of the CARES Act, we got money left over, and or these programs aren't working, like the Main Street Lending Program. So I've got some videos that talk about the Main Street Lending Program that will walk you through what that is, but basically it's for businesses that have less than 15,000 employees, but the loans thus far have been $1 million and above because of the requirements that have to be met to get the Main Street Lending Program. So we have money that's already been appropriated for, money that's already been approved, money that was already voted on and said, here's what we want to put into the American economy. So maybe this will help budge a little bit where Congress doesn't necessarily have to pass new monies. They don't have to borrow further on our children and grandchildren's future and future debt, so to speak, as many say. If they would just take what they've already appropriated for and say, well, this isn't working, this wasn't used, therefore let's go and put it into these programs. And in my estimation, the money that we're talking about here, which is probably almost $1 trillion, if we're taking the Main Street lending program, call it $598 billion. There's 100 to 130 billion out of the leftover PPP, not to mention the billions that got returned. There are other programs out there that were not fully sent out because there wasn't the need for it. Maybe that is where we will see the stimulus come out of, as in the stimulus checks, the unemployment, as well as the next round of PPP. So still feel confident that there is stimulus coming. I don't see a lot of action that's going to come into play this week. Biggest part of that is that with the RGB, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice that passed away, now Congress, D.C., seems to think that everybody in America is worried about who's going to be the next Supreme Court Justice, which probably those that can't pay rent, that is first on their mind. Those that are trying to figure out when they hit October 1, will they have money to make a car payment? That's probably actually a true priority for them on who's going to be the next Supreme Court Justice. So DC probably has it right. They definitely have the pulse on America in terms of what's important to us. And of course, you know, I'm being very sarcastic, which is this. My common message or consistent message has been pay attention to who's doing what in Congress and in Senate right now that you get to vote for coming up in November. Because if they're not paying attention to you and if they're not actively seeking stimulus and bringing everybody to the table, then they really need to not be reelected. I don't care who they are. I don't care what party they're in. So pay attention to who's taking care of you now. And I will tell you this right now, whether you like it or not, the White House is taking a lot of steps to try and provide stimulus. Whether you like it or not, the Democrats are taking lots of steps to provide stimulus. The Republicans are not. The Republicans are doing a double down on not providing more stimulus. They're dead set against providing stimulus to the states and the local governments. But that is holding up stimulus going to the American people. Yes, the Democrats are playing the same game by wanting to help the local and state governments. They're then also holding up support for the American people, but at least they've got a bill. So be paying attention to who's doing what. Don't be fooled, and by golly, don't be fooled by false news that you're going to potentially come across indicating that there's a stimulus check coming out this week because Mnuchin and Powell went before Congress saying that there needs to be a reallocation of funds. All that is a suggestion. Congress still needs to put this all together. So what you're looking for is what is the action of those that represent you right now on the stimulus bill. All right, hey, hope you're doing well. I'd love it if you'd subscribe, and then don't you ever forget, you've never met a CPA quite like me. All right, hey, have a great day.
You know what it is, man. Hey, we about to crack the CPA code. JJ the CPA, what up?